So this is the Unjerked podcast. This is part 2 of the episode on corruption. We are semi-affiliated with B. McGraw's website.
Just the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
And basically we try to look at things people talk about on Reddit and Twitter and try to find out what the truth is when you dig into the data. So let's get started. When it comes to the revolving door, so there's a Vox article that talks about a study, a report from Public Citizen, basically looking at where do members of Congress go. And I believe this is they look at people who left their seats in 2018. And it says out of 44 members of Congress who either retired or lost their seats in the midterms and then went to work in the private sector, 26, aka 2/3, got jobs at lobbying firms. This is it is a lot.
2/3. I didn't expect it to be that bad.
What I will say though is like the job of a lobbyist. And so when you work at a company and you're a lobbyist, you're not called a lobbyist. You're called, they say something like government affairs. So it's like, oh, you're a program manager of government affairs. And your job is to basically be the liaison that understands the politics and understands the legislation. And it makes sense that former congressmen or congresspeople become lobbyists because that's their bread and butter. Is they know how the process works. They know how legislation is written. They know who they need to talk to. And when you think about if you're a member of Congress, maybe if you were a lawyer before, you can go back to like your old law firm or something. But a lot of members of Congress, it's like they don't, the skills they learn as a member of Congress, they don't really transfer to that many other industries when you really think about it, right? Like where else?
No.
Basically having I guess if you know how to fundraise, that can help you work for like an organization where you need to raise money. But in terms of like knowing how legislation works, I mean, that only really applies to Congress. So I don't know. Still, it's pretty remarkable. 2/3. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, that is a lot. Maybe we should start a movement to banish all politicians to the island of Elba after their terms are up.
Well, I don't know if that works.
No, I don't know how you fix that. Like, do you ban them from working at just working period, or like?
You want members of Congress to. One thing that I'll talk about later is I think politicians should be paid much more. I think it should be a job where you're economically secure once you finish. I would also say, is there some way we can get a broader diversity of different career fields? Because you mostly have people who are currently in Congress are either career politicians or, maybe some independently wealthy businnesmen, some lawyers. I mean, a lot of lawyers, but some people who, maybe were practicing law for much longer. But you have very few scientists, very few doctors, very few engineers, very few, blue collar workers.
Who is that one guy that almost slipped in? Ben Carson? Just an actual doctor.
Anyways.
Yeah, that's real tough though, because it's almost like a specialized career field.
It is.
So I don't know how you slip more people in there.
I think if you're a governor, it's a lot easier to like get a job as like, a board member at a company or like a CEO at like, some like medium-sized corporation or something, because you do have like management experience as a governor, right? But I think as a congressperson, it's a much more sort of niche skill set. Strangely enough, because you think, being a high profile job, you think it would be a broader skill set, but it kind of isn't, interestingly.
No, and honestly, I don't know how anyone in Congress gets anything done, because if you kind of like imagine what they do in terms of like something relatable, it kind of seems impossible. It's like if you were with a group of 430 some odd other friends and you have to decide on what to get for dinner.
Yeah.
Like,
and also
how do you do that?
And also, imagine working at a company and like every 2 years you had to like raise a bunch of money to like keep your job. It's like, hey, if I don't raise $1 million, I'm going to get fired. So, so you have a couple questions posted here. Did we already kind of cover these?
Let me see. Oh yeah. Well, this was something we kind of touched on earlier. Is so like a lot of like lesser developed countries, corruption kind of takes the form of like something more obvious, like bribery or whatever. Is it primarily a U.S. thing or generally developed countries thing that corruption's mostly quid pro quo and not like very obvious bribery?
Well, I do think, I think, I don't have data to back this, but I think when you have a country which more robustly nips to the, basically more robustly stops illegal corruption, by definition, legal corruption is legal. If it's allowed, it's allowed. So I think that's why you kind of tend to see, why do you have these, less overt forms of corruption happen? It's because they're not against the law, and so they're going to happen. I think it's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
And
well,
then
it's almost like it's like corruption is going to happen, and like you can, it's the whack-a-mole game. You get it in one spot, and then it just pops up somewhere else because bad actors will just show up everywhere, no matter what you do.
I think you can make it less bad. I don't think you can get rid of it completely, but you can certainly make it better.
I am a fan of living somewhere where I can, get a license to do something without bribing somebody.
Yeah, there's countries where, like, if you don't play the game, basically the government's going to just, like, take all your stuff. And that doesn't really happen to the same extent in the U.S. or in other countries. So I do think there are differences in terms of severity. And then
the next second question up there is, have you seen anything on whether or not national or local politics are more corrupt?
So I don't have data on this, but I have read about this, and I think it's almost like it's pretty clear that local politics is much more corrupt. And the reason why, the mechanism why this happens, is there's just less eyes on local politics. And, you need, and we'll talk later about how to stop corruption, but like you need to have eyes on, journalists looking into things. And there's just not as much journalism at the local level, especially in recent decades. So, you have obvious cases where, you have cases where like, and you've seen videos where like a DA gets pulled over for drunk driving and then like gets off because, they're like, oh, well, I'm the district attorney, so you can't throw me in jail. Things as simple as that. But and then there was that case somewhere in like Pennsylvania where you had these judges who were like throwing children in juvenile prisons. And,
that's one of the reasons why I was wondering is like, because like when you're at the national level, like it becomes higher visibility, but with higher visibility, like even if you take the effort to cover something up, people on the right will say, oh, Joe Biden and the Hunter laptop case, they obviously tried to cover that up. Or, with Trump, one of the current trials is over, hush money, trying to buy a story. Like, people do find it, and then it's kind of the Streisand effect. Like it gets more visibility. Just the fact that they tried to cover it up. At a local level, if there's not a lot of like news and visibility to it, it's probably easier to get away with stuff.
And oftentimes, certain positions people basically run unopposed because nobody really bothers to run against someone, and so it's like, hey, like I don't even have someone to run against me. So I do think there's quite a bit more corruption at the lower levels, at the local level.
Yeah, that's why I asked. My intuition says I bet you like if you like normalized it would be more at the local level. And it just looks like there's more at the national level because it's more visible. So you're more aware of it.
Yeah. So you came up with a list of things you found on Reddit in terms of like the circle jerk. Yeah. Do you want to talk about those a little?
Let me grab a beer real quick, and this will give you a chance to introduce our new sponsors for this podcast, the Koch brothers. Be right back.
All right, you back?
I am back now.
Okay.
I hope that was a good ad from the Koch brothers.
Yeah, it was pretty good. Okay. And by the way, okay, I was trying to think of a joke, but nothing came up.
I hate it when that happens.
Ad-libbing jokes. When it goes well, it goes well. When it doesn't, it doesn't. But you gotta.
Yeah, you just kind of have to eat it.
Yeah.
All right. So, let me just go off the list and we can go through it. So, I mean, this is kind of like the basic one that any middle school or high schooler will write in their college freshman year philosophy paper. I guess college student is so like it's all just from rich people basically making their own oligarchy, a lot of corruption. So once they have the power, like why are they ever going to give up the power? Say like why would a congressman ever institute in their own term limits or limit themselves?
I do think, I think that's true to an extent. I do think in a representative democracy, with enough pressure, you do still see people respond to that, which is why I think apathy is the worst thing you can have, because people think, well, apathy is self-fulfilling. It's like, oh, well, I can't make a difference. Well, you kind of automatically, you're right if that's your mindset. But when it comes to like, why would members of Congress, implement policies that are bad for themselves? In fact, in the 1990s, I think the last amendment that was ever passed for the U.S. Constitution was basically this amendment saying if Congress votes in pay raises for themselves, it doesn't go into effect until the next session starts. And so that's bad for them, but they did implement it. Well, so I think the way amendments work is that 2/3 of Congress, a certain percentage of Congress has to like basically propose it, and then the states have to ratify it. But, enough members of Congress decided that it was worth, suggesting. So I do think with enough pressure, but there is a natural resistance. I agree. I think term limits, I think a certain amount of term limits makes sense, but there's also value in having members of Congress be there for a long time. Because if, like, for example, if members of Congress could only serve one term, then lobbyists would have a lot more power because lobbyists would have like institutional memory. It's like, hey, I'm a lobbyist and I've been here for 30 years. And then I know every member of Congress will only be here for 2 years or for 6 years or whatever. So it actually could backfire. But I do think like moderate.
That would be one of the ways that it would backfire. One way it could good fire. I don't know the term for that. One of the positive things is, say you have people that leave and become lobbyists as politicians that, know the networks, know how it works, know how to pull the strings on the system. Well, if every few years the entire network changes, then now you don't have any ends.
I perhaps, but I still think that's a good point. There's two sides to it.
It's kind of like I've always heard this for why they move military members so much, especially officers. Is that like if like it was like a defense against like people getting too much local power and eventually like having a coup or something. Like if you move them around too much, they don't get enough power.
Yeah, I mean, maybe moderate term limits would make sense. Like, three terms or whatever.
I think a lot of people would be a fan of that.
Well, the flip side, so there's an interesting statistic, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's like, only like 10% of people approve of Congress, but 90% of people approve of their own congressperson, their own member of Congress. And so, despite people complaining about Congress, incumbents consistently get voted in at quite a high rate. interestingly enough.
Yeah.
And
that is usually what happens.
Yeah. What else do you have?
Well, let's see here. We kind of already touched on this one about politicians. It feels more like an oligarchy because you don't get a lot of just like average Joes in there. You know, you could say like Senator Warren. You know, is she was a teacher or something.
She was a professor.
But, you know, she was. I thought she was like a lower level teacher.
No, she was. I think she was a college. I think she taught at like Harvard or Princeton or something like that.
Oh my gosh. Why did I think she was like an elementary school teacher or something? But yeah, like you don't really hear about like just average Joes getting in, so it doesn't quite feel representative. But also on the flip side, like most like average Joes, I would not trust with one of the most complicated jobs in the country.
Right, but representative I don't think that has to mean like perfect mirror of society. Like, for example, does Congress have to be X percent of people in the population are like ex-cons or whatever who like went to prison before? Like, do we need the same percentage in Congress who like went to prison? Or like, do we like, you know, do like, let's say X percent are unemployed. Do we need like one member of Congress who's like chronically unemployed and like never had a job? Like, you know, at a certain point, I think in my mind, representative democracy is more about people choosing, like, this is a member of our community who we think should be able to like advocate for us. And I don't think it has to mean. There is an argument that people who are less wealthy, you know, because like running for Congress, it's a full-time job. And like, if you're a blue collar person with no money, you can't just quit your job for like a year to run for Congress, you know? So.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that, but I think that's the thing. Oh, yeah. Also, while I was researching, I clicked on some random link. I didn't know what the subreddit was, and then I opened it up, and it turned out to be a really in-depth subreddit post on what happened to the Star Wars Republic to become so corrupt. I didn't read too far into it, but it took me like a paragraph and a half until I realized where I was.
Anyways.
Anyhow, I had to put that there. Also, the next, why would anyone allow for a watchdog? But also, it's kind of the who watches the watchmen problem. Like, say you have a bunch of corrupt cops, and then they institute some anti-bribery law, but yeah, like, you know, how do you like stop a cop from breaking the law if no one else is watching that cop?
You can have a watchman and just have like the Spider-Man pointing at each other thing.
We need a KGB style circle of trust.
Well, I think if you have like rival organizations that keep watch of each other and you keep them separate enough, I think that'll help. You know, but I do think there are, because like in Congress, you know, well, there's an organization called the GAO, Government Accountability Office, that basically kind of writes reports on whether, you know, things are actually happening the way they're supposed to happen. And they actually write pretty good reports talking about how, like, you know, this program is over budget and the reason why is because of this. And so I do think that is a problem. Like, you know, who watches the Watchmen? But, you know, I think it's better than not. I think having a Watchman is better than having no Watchman, you know?
Yeah.
So
I agree with that.
It says here you heard that historically heavy bureaucracies require some corruption. And then you talk about
this was on. I thought this was really interesting, but I heard this on the History of China podcast. But there was a period in medieval China, which I thought this is kind of interesting. So if you have a large enough bureaucracy, and you know, China historically, you know, has always had some level of bureaucracy with like kind of academic elites who were able to take their exams and get those positions in the first place. So there was some emperor that wanted to tackle corruption, and when he did, there were some like forms of corruption that kind of greased the wheels of bureaucracy. Like people were just like pre-filling out forms that they weren't supposed to, because if you pre-filled out a form and gave it to someone, then, you know, they could use that form to do some, you know, nonsensical stuff that, wouldn't have like government official approval or something. But, as soon as he had tackled too much corruption, then they were like, oh, but we had all these rules to actually get stuff done. But, it's kind of a weird argument to make, because it's like, if bureaucracy is that bad in the first place, maybe like don't have as many rules.
Well, there used to be a thing in Congress called pork barrel spending, where basically you're like, hey, if you help me pass this bill, I'm going to put in a rider that basically like builds a bridge in your district or whatever. And there was a lot of this. And John McCain really pushed against it, saying this is corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a strong argument that getting rid of pork barrel spending led to a lot more polarization in Congress, because there was no longer an incentive to work with people across the aisle, because there was no longer that like, hey, I'll build something in your district situation. I think the thing though is like, is it really, assuming the actual thing you build is actually productive? I know there's like the bridge to nowhere thing, but like assuming it's an actual useful, value added public infrastructure or service or what have you, is it really corruption? Because you're basically like, for example, building when NASA has like facilities all over the country because they're in different congressional districts, like I guess it makes it a little less efficient, but like if you're still like achieving a public good and it's not going in someone's pocket nefariously, like I don't know if it really is corruption per se. You know what I mean?
It's one of those things that's that's why like the more complicated forms of corruption can be like really hard to call out. Like, there's probably a lot of good stuff that goes into bills that like obviously like is not the name of the bill. I mean, the most recent example I'm thinking of is the Inflation Reduction Act should have been called a Green Energy Act, because apparently they put in all of these things to help develop the green energy market, but like doesn't feel like it had anything to do with reducing inflation. And I think that's like an example of that, where you could argue, we should be doing that, but why is it in this bill?
Yeah, I don't know if that's corruption, really. That's more just politicking and maneuvering and messaging.
Well, it's like it's corrupt if it's a bad thing, but it's just convenience and playing the game if it's a good thing.
Well, if it leads to a degradation of the public good, or it leads to money going into the wrong person's pocket, then it's corruption. But if you have a creative branding exercise to get something passed, but it's still something that is in the mandate of Congress, for example, to like have that policy or to put money in that thing, I don't think that's really corruption. That's just kind of playing the politics game, I guess. Anyways, regarding like heavy bureaucracy requiring corruption, I don't know if I have this study available, but they looked into like, does corruption actually increase efficiency by basically greasing the skids? And it seems like for the most part, it's kind of the opposite. Because if you have corruption, like a level of bribe taking involved, then your incentive is to add extra hurdles to jump over for extra opportunities for you to like collect bribes. And so when bribery is rampant, your incentive is to put up as many hurdles as you can, right? So I think for the most part, I don't think corruption actually makes things more efficient, even in heavy bureaucracies. That's my opinion. There's obviously always the need to like play politics and like, try to see like, who do I need to talk to about this thing and how do I like get them to listen to me? But I don't think corruption's really the answer for the most part.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting because a lot of the, what might feel like corruption, where it's like a quid pro quo, and congressmen like, well, I'll pass this bill if you put this thing in the bill. Like, that is a politician being your representative and putting something that will benefit your community potentially in a bill. But that's only if it's something to benefit their community and not just them. So it kind of taste like corruption, but might not be.
Well, if you said like, hey, if you add a rider that like says like I, Congressperson so and so, gets a free boat, that's obviously corruption. But like if it's like, hey, build a bridge in this city, unless it's like assuming it's a bridge that adds value, it's not a bridge in the middle of nowhere. I don't think that's necessarily corruption. So,
yep. We already talked about the next bullet so we can skip that one. All right, on to the circle jerk solutions to corruption. This might not just be a circle jerk solution, but more participation in the political process. We talk about this one all the time. Especially at the local level. I don't know if you want to touch on that one that much.
I think that's self-explanatory.
Yeah, we'll move on. Being better informed, that's also another one. And also why if I had to guess, I bet you there's more corruption at the local level versus the national level is, as soon as you expose a corruption, like it might look like it's more corrupt, but you're tackling the corruption by exposing it in the first place. So, if people aren't informed about corruption, then it just kind of slides by. So, it's all very much a Streisand effect. Like, if someone is found covering up something, then it starts to look even worse. I don't think there's that much discussion with that one. I mean, that's pretty obvious.
And then when it comes to jailing politicians, so
that's the next bullet point.
Yeah, it's hard to talk. It's hard to talk about outside the context of what's going on right now. But as a general principle, I think, it can go both ways. You do have situations where politicians have their opponents jailed. I think I think the caveat is like it depends on how corrupt your society is already. I think in high corruption societies, ironically, the place where maybe people commit the most crimes that are worthy of prison, that also could be an environment where it's easier for a politician to have their opponents imprisoned. I do think in low corruption societies, I do think it's in many countries, they do throw politicians in prison for corruption charges.
South Korea.
South Korea
they do that regularly.
And in France, I think one of the
France does it too, huh?
Yeah, one of the former presidents, I think, is under house arrest or was under house arrest for some sort of corruption charge. So, I don't think complete immunity of politicians from going to prison, I don't really think that's a good thing. I think it's tough because it's like, how do you do it without making it political?
I think you framed it about right. Like, it's a real slippery slope when you're living in like if the society's already very, very corrupt, because then it's like a very easy weapon for people to use against their opponents. But if society is not that corrupt, and you're not having to do it all the time, and you can save it for like real egregious cases, then I think it's a good thing, and I'm kind of a fan of it.
Right.
Me personally. But, I think that it definitely would only work if you're able to maintain like a good enough separation between courts and the politicians themselves.
And then the next one you mentioned, the tearing it all down argument.
That revolution will solve all of your corruption cases. I think if you study any type of revolution, go binge all of Mike Duncan's podcast on that one. I don't think that's a good solution to corruption.
I think it's kind of the opposite. When you have a revolutionary state where there's all sorts of anarchy and conflict, that's where corruption becomes ripe. That's an environment where corruption becomes a lot easier to do. And also the people who always say tear the system, like the people who always talk about tearing the system down, like a lot of those people would never last in like an actual revolutionary environment because it's very violent. It's not a nice place to be overall. I would say there are cases where you need to completely change the system. Like, for example, like we need to write a new constitution because, the old one was given to us by some like outside power, et cetera, et cetera. But like there should, in my mind, there should still be some sort of referendum or some sort of, group of people who kind of convene together and discuss it. I think just like ripping everything apart, usually revolutions are usually very violent and lead to dictatorships. That's what usually happens.
I think, revolutions are only a good idea in very, very, very extreme cases of governments being really awful and corrupt. Otherwise, they're on average not worth it, and incremental change is better.
All right, that was part 2. We'll see you with the final episode on the topic of corruption.